Should you read about Socrates? What's up? It's Jesse from It's Lit Book Reviews here to do another solo one really quickly. Just going to talk about a book I recently read called The Shadows of Socrates, The Heresy, War, and Treachery Behind the Trial of Socrates. And I'm just going to let you know whether or not I think you should read this book, especially if you have not read about Socrates. If you don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with that name. He's the guy who asked a lot of questions. He is the Greek philosopher. And this specifically is about his trial, but more the history leading up to it so you can kind of understand the context of it. But anyway, this book just came out in the beginning of 2024, so still less than a year ago at the time of recording this. It's written by Matt Gatton. This book only has 18 ratings on Goodreads, so it is by no means a book that has popped off, at least if Goodreads is to be referenced. But it's got a 4.11 right now out of 5 stars with 18 ratings. So less than 20 people have mostly enjoyed it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I did really enjoy it. And I would recommend this book. If you haven't read anything about Socrates or if you haven't read a lot of ancient history, I think this definitely might be a good entry level book, just kind of into that whole realm. I will say I've read a good bit of ancient history at this point. It's not like a scholarly academic type of work in comparison to a lot of the other antiquity history that I have read. He presents it in a little more of a novel-esque way. Um, and just doesn't present things or deliver them quite the same as most of the historians of ancient history that I've read. But I don't think it means to be that. I do think it's trying to be something a little different. So, not necessarily mark against it, but I did give it 4 stars just kind of for that, for it not seeming quite, and it is referenced. There's notes in the back and all that good stuff that comes with any good history book. But just didn't feel quite as fleshed out in the actual text. And I will say I didn't love some of the writing quirks from this author. He just had a lot of moments throughout the book where he put something in parentheses, like a joke or like a little quip, or he does things, and this just always annoys me with any history, where he says something that is very obviously a parallel to today's geopolitical realm, but then he puts in parentheses, "Oh, and this is just like stuff that we're seeing today. It's very applicable to what we see now." And it's like, yeah, dude, that's kind of the thing with history. We're reading it so we don't repeat our mistakes. It's kind of the whole, you know, trope, I guess. Is that the right thing to say with history in general? Is that if you don't know it, you're doomed to repeat it. So yeah, we're actively looking for those parallels if we're reading history. I get it. Again, if it's for more of a casual reader, they might appreciate moments like that, like a aha. But I don't know. It just felt kind of silly to me at times. But still, a really entertaining read. It's like 250 pages. I read it in 2 days. Kind of ripped through it. It's definitely a really easy read. Pretty engaging. But what I will say is, again, it's more so the history that gives context to the trial of Socrates. It does have a full chapter at the end going over what we think we know happened at the trial of Socrates, which I didn't realize. We only have his responses. We don't have any of the like questions or responses to Socrates. We just have what he said, which is kind of strange. I don't know how we only end up with that, but whatever. So it does get to that, but it's kind of leading up. So what he's trying to show. So sorry, the trial of Socrates, what they accused him of was essentially going against what the understood religious practices were and misleading the youth. Like, it's very strange accusations, and he was put to death for it. Um, but it walks you through what that really meant and what they were saying. At the end of the book, he kind of makes the argument that they were really just using this as an excuse because they just wanted to get rid of him, old vendettas and that type of thing. But to look at the context of what they accused him of is really interesting. The whole leading the youth astray, it seems to be really in reference to certain pupils, one-time pupils of Socrates, specifically Alcibiades and Callias. I don't know if I'm saying that second name right. I know Alcibiades is right because I looked it up because it's spelled crazy, some ancient name. But Alcibiades was a one-time pupil of Socrates, and both he and Callias were both adopted sons from different parents. but adopted sons of Pericles, who was a big deal in Athens at the time of his life, seen as like a, you know, a founder, forefather esque type of figure. He wasn't the founder of Athens by any means, but a big deal at that point in history. So, you know, they come up and they end up having different positions in Athens, but Alcibiades specifically goes on this crazy tirade where he wants power in Athens and then he doesn't quite get it. So he betrays them to Sparta. And then he ends up sleeping with the wife of a Spartan general. And then they're after him. So he's, you know, he's got a warrant out for his head basically, from Athens and Sparta. Then he gets involved with Persia, just all this crazy stuff that I didn't really know much about and is really interesting, but it's not really about Socrates. So I would say that there is really interesting and fun to read history, but it's not all about Socrates. And that kind of goes back to one of the things that I didn't like about the writing of this one was that he would talk about Alcibiades for a particular amount of time, and then he'd put, and I just want to remind the reader that the reason we're talking about this is because this was one of the accusations against Socrates, and I want you to understand why they might have been accusing him of that. And it's like, yeah, dude, we know. We don't need you to keep reminding us of that, but whatever, I get it. Is what it is. It's a very small gripe. But it's really entertaining reading about the crazy stuff that Alcibiades did, but also Callias, who kind of ties into the other portion of the accusations against Socrates, which was him. I should have written it down, the exact term they used for what they accused him of, but it had to do with not respecting or appreciating the religious practices, and saying other things that would lead people astray, in the eyes of, you know, the religious folk. And it has to do with a specific thing called the mysteries of Eleusium. And I'm not going to, you know, explain the entire book and ruin it, but it's this really interesting religious practice that they had in Athens, where these people would go through this into this building, and they were having there was essentially, the theory is that there was an effect that the religious priests, who Callias was one of the main figures in the book, they essentially had what's called a camera obscura, and they made it look like things were there that weren't. That's the theory that the author is putting forward. And later in his life, we believe later in his life, shortly before the trial, Socrates basically had the allegory of the cave, which is one of his really popular uh, works that we know of that's written down. And he draws the conclusion, the author, that the accusation against him is him referencing the mysteries, or, you know, without naming them, referencing the mysteries of Eleusium, um, in his allegory of the cave, and disrespecting them, basically saying like, hey, they're just doing this fancy little trick to make you think something is going on that's really not. So our religious practice is kind of a sham, is essentially what's inferred by this book, and they ended up killing him for it. But anyway, it's really interesting to read about. Again, I would recommend this book if you haven't read a lot of ancient history. If you've read a lot of ancient history, I would imagine this book's probably not something that would be super important for you to read, unless you don't know a lot about Alcibiades. But again, I thought it was really interesting. I read it quick. It's an easy read. Some interesting things about Socrates, if you don't know more about him. One of the big things in Socratic, the Socratic method is all about asking questions. And one of the big results from that he talks about is he essentially makes a point that any mistakes or errors that occur, most of those things that happen in life where people make mistakes that lead to any type of consequence, big or small. He said, there are three types of people in this world in any situation. There are those that know, there are those that know they don't know, and there are those that don't know that they don't know. And he makes an argument that 9 times out of 10, errors in society occur when the person who makes a decision or takes an action is a person who doesn't know that they don't know. And he's essentially, he makes it very simple. He says, if you are a carpenter, I forget his exact example, but if you're a carpenter, you know what you know about carpentry, but you're not a farmer. And so a good carpenter knows that he knows carpentry, but also knows that he doesn't know farming. So he's not going to go and try and cultivate farmland when he knows nothing about it. Whereas a person who doesn't know that they don't know might go try and do that and ruin that land, whatever it might be, go bankrupt. So it's very, and that can be applied in any situation. And it's just a, again, the Socratic method is all about asking questions. And that's kind of the basis for him of asking questions. You don't know what you don't know. So before you take an action, make sure that you've determined if there are things you don't know. And that's one of the things that's awesome about history. The reason I love reading history is because the more you read, the more you realize you don't know, the more you realize that's out there. There's all types of different stories and documents and theories and opinions about history. And there's just so much more to learn. So that was a cool thing. And then probably the most famous quip that I think is attributed to Socrates is that, and I wrote it down right here to make sure I say it right. The life which is unexamined is not worth living, or the unexamined life is not worth living. Um, Obviously, I mean that, self-explanatory quote. Again, to go back to the Socratic method, all about asking questions and why do I believe what I believe? Why is our society the way it is? Is this right? Is it wrong? Where does that morality come from? That leads you down the Socratic method of just constantly asking questions. And for whatever reason, the people at the time of Socrates' trial were not a fan of questions. So it's a really good read. Reading what Socrates said during his trial is really interesting. Just the way that he poses these questions and makes everyone realize that, first of all, the trial is a sham, but not only that, but a lot of just the preconceived notions we have about people in society or don't really have a lot of basis in fact. So it's really interesting. The Shadows of Socrates by Matt Gatton. Again, I would recommend it if you don't have a lot of reading experience in ancient history. I think it'd be a fun, easy read. And yeah, that's it. Socrates out.